Hola, buena tarde. No. ¿Sí? Okay. So let's start the session. Buena tarde, buenas tardes, and a very good evening to all of you. Tonight we have the pleasure to welcome Professor Adham Saouli. I'm delighted that he has accepted our invitation, and I also would like to thank the YIMED for organizing this cycle of lectures, the Ciclo Aula Mediterránea, and of course for hosting us tonight. I am going to introduce first Professor Saouli before giving him the floor. His presentation is going to take approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session with questions by you, our audience. So Professor Saouli is Professor of Politics and International Relations, and he's also the head of the Critical Security Studies program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Doha, Qatar. He's also currently on leave from the University of St. Andrews, where he is Professor of International Relations and Middle East Politics at the School of International Relations. Professor Saouli is the founding editor of Disruptions, a book series on social movements, revolutions, and activism that is published by Edinburgh University Press, and he's also on the editorial board of Siyasat Arabiya. With his research, Professor Saouli is bridging the fields of international relations, comparative politics, and Middle Eastern studies. Inspired by the tradition of historical sociology, his work explores the genesis and development of political actors, states, social movements, or individuals, and ideas. He's the author of the book, The Arab State, Dilemmas of Late Formation, as well as Hezbullah, Socialisation and its Tragic Ironies. He has published numerous studies on state formation, middle powers, revolutions, democratizations, foreign policy, and the politics of divided states. At present, Professor Saouli is exploring the historical origins and contemporary political impact of the Arabo-Islamic concept of fitna. And also, and importantly, Professor Saouli is currently editing, together with May Darwish, a book on international relation theories in the Middle East, with each chapter treating a different theory of international relations, which is then applied to an empirical case. The book is going to be a fabulous resource, and it is eagerly awaited. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Saouli.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I'd like to start by thanking the European Institute of the Mediterranean for this kind invitation. I'm genuinely very happy to be here with you and to share a few ideas on the past and present of the Middle East. So thank you, Dr. Olivia, too, for the invitation. My talk will focus on what I'm terming as two tales of freedom, and it will explore the nexus between the international relations of the region and what happens domestically between regimes and societies. So my focus will be on two specific tales that I believe have shaped the region since its emergence around 100 years ago as a state system. One is a tale of regimes or states or regimes seeking freedom from external powers. And in brief, I'll elaborate later, that's the struggle against colonial powers, before that the Ottoman Empire, but the struggle seems to be continuing. And the story comes with a lot of norms, but also actions. The second one is a tale of the people seeking freedom from regimes, ruling regimes. There's a reason why I put the state in quotation and the people in quotation, and that's briefly because regimes tend to present themselves as the state. But also when various political and social segments within society speak of the people, also they tend to present a tale. I'll elaborate a little bit more on this matter. My central argument is this. I believe there has been a clash between these two tales of freedom, these two struggles for freedom. And occasionally the clash led to the suppression of political freedoms within societies, particularly when ruling regimes tend to use the tale of freedom, their tale of freedom, to suppress the quest for freedom within societies. And the story will take us through the historical phases in the region, reaching more or less this period. I do apologize in advance if the general argument is a bit too general and the stories I'll be telling are a bit overarching, but there is always opportunity to spend some time in the Q&A discussing the various phases in after the lecture. Let me just say a few words about why I'm calling them tales. I mean, I could have used, of course, the concept of a narrative, but tales are, as you very well know, they're stories we tell each other, we tell the world about ourselves, about others, about our identities, about our struggles. They also represent visions of the future, but they also, and crucially, say a story about the past. And you'll see in my own tale here, I'll bring the past and connect it to the present in very much detailed ways. So political actors tend to use these tales, and a major difference from narratives, if you want, is that a tale is plausibly a lie too. It's an exaggeration. Sometimes it takes a dramatic form. So it's plausibly a lie, but there's something true about it. And that's the two dimensions of what I'm calling a tale. But let's think about them, generally speaking, as stories. Now, why do we use stories, tales, narratives? Because simply political action is expressed through narratives, through stories, not only to offer a vision to those we want to mobilize as political actors, but also to justify our own actions. And usually this requires, as I said earlier, an understanding of the past, but also a vision for the future. Through these stories, we tend to construct the political world. Not only through stories, I must emphasize, but today I'll be focusing more on these stories. And given the brief description so far, you would not be surprised if tales also link to identities. Every political actor has an identity that they're trying to promote, usually a rival identity that they are in contention with. So they're very much linked to who they are and what they want to present themselves as. So it's also linked to their social standing and political goals. And hence there is identities and politics, of course, intermingle. But you could go further to argue that you can't understand politics without identities, and you can't understand identities without the stories that express these identities. Lastly, tales are important because they connect the past to the present and lay bare a vision to the future. And I'll be saying a little bit more about the relationship to the past. especially in the case of the Middle East and the Arab world, the past matters. I believe this is the case in every society, in every region. But here the past matters a lot. And I want to argue that history matters for three important reasons. History matters for many reasons, but I'll focus on only three for now. First, by exploring these historical social processes, we understand how the past continues to shape and impact the present. And this is still at a very theoretical and abstract level. I'll come back to the empirics of it, offer some illustrations. Second, history matters because what Max Weber calls fateful events that happen in the past set a process, sets a trajectory that generates a new context for future generations. For example, the collapse and disintegration of the Ottoman Empire around 100 years ago was a fateful event in the history of the region. It drew a line between the past, the Ottoman past, and started a new process where we now can speak of states in the region. Thirdly, history matters because events such as wars, revolutions, or even the emergence of concepts such as democracy or models such as authoritarianism that emerge and take place in certain times offer templates and vernaculars for later generations to emulate. And this is once again quite important. Think of the Bolshevik Revolution as a model for some revolutions to emulate in the rest of the world. Or take the concept of, say, democracy, a norm that emerged in Europe but also spread to the rest of the world, setting a standard. For all of these reasons, history matters. And as we will see in the case of the Middle East, history is quite important. The making of the current state system in the Middle East, and I'll tell you why I'm offering this historical background, because it's key to understand the tales that emerge at a later stage. Two key important historical factors shape the emergence of the state system in the region, the region as we now know it. One is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Basically, this is how the Ottoman Empire developed over time and then ultimately collapsed in the beginning of the 20th century. Its disintegration was a key factor in the emergence of a new region, but there is another factor, and that's the spread and diffusion of colonial powers, namely, in the case of the Middle East, France and Britain, which, through their expansion, they shaped the development of the region, particularly the emergence of the state system. And of course, the ideas they brought with them or were imported from Europe around the end of the 19th century. This is how the Ottoman Empire, more or less, looked like, always covering strategic areas of what we now call the Middle East. But that's the region we have inherited. And as you can see, there's an important change, the emergence of political boundaries, which we sometimes easily call states, but the deeper you dig in, the more complex and difficult the story becomes. Ultimately, the European colonial powers managed to divide the region into initially spheres of influence, which would later emerge into what we now call states. Territories with generally recognized political boundaries, a people, and a government. Of course, not all these entities were under the Ottoman Empire. Morocco, for instance, was never under the Ottoman Empire as such. And central Saudi Arabia, historically, or Najd, was also outside of the realm of the Ottoman Empire. But this was the drawing of political boundaries was a key moment in the emergence of the region. Now, beyond the drawing of boundaries, which in some cases were quite haphazard to a large extent, simply, you can see them even from the straight lines sometimes separating Egypt from Libya or Egypt from Sudan, which tells you how colonial powers managed to divide these countries. But imagine for a moment how it would have looked like had you been a member of the former Ottoman Empire and the emerging state system. One can not definitely know how you'd see, perceive, or feel, but you can imagine that the world around you is radically changing. Suddenly you have political boundaries, sometimes policed by two colonial powers, Britain and France. New governments, and the idea of the state is emerging, becoming part of the political vocabulary. These major changes formed critical political and intellectual challenges for the peoples of the region, for their intellectuals, and for their political leaders. Key questions were asked intellectually in an attempt to make sense of these huge changes that were taking place. Mind you, in European history, these kind of changes took centuries to crystallize. The drawing of political boundaries. And of course, they keep on changing. They kept on changing, and they keep on changing until now. But in the Arab world, broadly, and more broadly the Middle East, these were quite radical changes. You're speaking in around 3 or 4 decades, radical changes. So key thinkers in the region from the Arab world had big questions to answer. One is, how is the region going to be organized politically? Because there was resistance to precisely this. Why? Because the colonial powers drew the boundaries. The peoples of the region had no choice in these changes. So how do you organize the region politically? Which identity and or ideology will form the basis for the new political order? Again, critical questions. Arab and Muslim intellectuals provided, generally speaking, 3 visions of the regions. Visions that will form what I'm calling here tales of freedom. One is Arab nationalism. The idea that the Arabs of the region, regardless of the imposed political boundaries, form a group, form a nation, and hence they ought to be together under one political authority, which by the beginning of the 20th century we began to call a state. Not necessarily a common concept in previous eras. Arab nationalism called for establishing of a state that would unite all Arabs. And then other visions involved Islamism, that you could be an Arab, but you could also be a Turk or an Iranian or a Kurd. But what unites all of these individuals and peoples is their Muslim identity. And these Islamist intellectuals wanted to restore the caliphate that was lost with the Ottoman Empire. So you had the Islamist political vision, which again was a tale in the sense that it offered an understanding of the past, an attempt to understand and diagnose the present, but also it has the elements of an ideology because it offered a vision for the future. And there were other visions, and these formed more or less what you would call the nation-state visions. Syrian nationalism, Lebanese nationalism, Egyptian nationalism. All of these faces that you see here on the screen offered certain visions. People like Antoun Saadi, or he was the ideologue of Syrian nationalism, an ideology that would bring the peoples of what we now know as the Levant, more or less Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. Or Jawad Boulos, who wanted to establish Lebanese nationalism. He's here on a post stamp in, what was it, 2015, again, remembering him in Lebanon. Or Hassan al-Banna offering an Islamic vision, among many, many others. Then you have people like Saad al-Husri, an Arab nationalist who played the key role not only in establishing Arab nationalism as an ideology, but also played the key role in the education sector, because you need to educate people about their identity, their language, their past, but also you're constructing individuals who would become citizens, they hoped, of a state. All of these tales were key elements in the fight, the struggle against colonialism. These weren't mere ideas. They also formed the ideological foundations for social movements to emerge, and at a later stage for political parties, and ultimately ruling coalitions, or regimes as we call them. So the ideational sphere is important in the sense that it provides meaning to a society, and especially to societies who observe these major historical changes. A tale of a country's sense of identity, its history, and symbols, which were all key elements of state building and nation building. I'm calling this as the weight of the past. And you know, as Marx say, men, and one should now add women, make history, but they don't make it under circumstances that they have chosen, but under circumstances that come from the past. So in that sense, the past is very important. So this takes us to another phase in the history of the region, when the ideas that emerged towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century begin to crystallize as political programs in, say, the Arab nationalist movements, the Ba'ath movement, communists, Islamists. Hassan al-Banna was not only a founder of modern Islamist thought, but also he was a founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, one of the oldest movements in the region. With time, these ideas translated into political programs, and struggles for freedom began to emerge. in the period between 1920 and 1952. We could demarcate the area, but it depends on what you're looking at. It was during this period that many political movements in the region resisted the colonial imposition of political boundaries, but also resisted colonial rule as such. In Egypt, in what would later become Libya, a bloody struggle in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, the Levant. In the Gulf, you had similar stories, movements seeking independence, but what emerged are conservative regimes, more or less representing movements within these countries and their social organization. There was a key important moment in the during the Second World War, when the power of Britain and France was eroding and ultimately disappearing, and the world was beginning to form two new great powers. Of course, it's the United States representing the capitalist, democratic bloc, and the Soviet Union presenting the communist and Soviet blocs. These were important international changes which offered opportunities for domestic leaders to get rid of the British and French and establish new regimes. And this is what most of these leaders did, starting with the Egyptian Revolution in 1952 with Jamal Abdel Nasser. I'm sure you know him, but just in case, the guy here on the left. And during the 1950s, several military coups led to social revolutions. In many of these countries, especially Egypt and Syria, you had a ruling class, usually ruling in alliance with the British or French, keeping social forces either suppressed or, in best case scenarios, under control, but also siding with social classes who also held the land, the aristocracy, which in the case of Egypt, basically they dominated over most of the fertile plots of land, and hence all of this had a critical implications on the politics of it. In Egypt, several ideological movements emerged, very much resembling the ideological frameworks I talked about. Islamists, Egyptian nationalists represented in Misr al-Fatah with its fascist orientations, Al-Wafd Party, a nationalist party with liberal inclinations, socialist movements, and some Arab nationalist movements. All of these movements were more or less beginning to take their social and political space during or pre-1952, until we had the military coup in 1952, which was not unique in the sense that other Arab countries had similar military coups. Why the military? Well, most of these ideas tended to seep into the military organizations, especially when the middle class, the newly educated middle class, was given permission to become officers in the militaries of Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. In the military, they began to establish their own cells and then began to conspire to overturn the ruling regimes, which, as I said, were in alliance with the colonial powers. And this is what Nasser and the so-called free officers, his comrades, did in 1952, toppled the monarchy and set specific goals. Once again, here we begin to see a political tale emerging in Egypt and later Syria, Iraq, Libya, and later on Algeria. And as we shall see, not very far from Iran, even in the 70s, until the Islamic Revolution in 1979. What were the goals? And the most important norm, which more or less resonated with the norms of the people and the demands of the people then, was to end colonial rule and to end feudalism and to establish land reforms. Very key social and political norms. Social justice, because most of these coalitions were to a large extent nationalist but also left-leaning. And national independence emerged as a very key norm, which wasn't only a formative norm, but it was also a norm that would be reproduced by various regimes until this moment, focusing on the freedom of these countries, but as we shall see also the freedom of these regimes from external powers, but also crucially from their domestic collaborators. And of course, when I say collaborators, I mean collaborators as it is framed by the ruling regimes for their own interests. All of these regimes, whether in Egypt or in Iraq, the military coup was in 1958, but also produced a coalition of Arab nationalists and socialists and Baathists. But then in 1969 with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and later on in Iraq with Saddam Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, and of course his son in the right lower corner of the screen, who is still ruling Syria until this moment. What these regimes were initially doing were not only toppling the previous regimes and attempting to get rid of the colonial powers, they were also constructing the future through the narratives. And as you would expect in these societies and in every society, there is never an agreement of a dominant or hegemonic ideology. Why? Simply because you have different political movements competing for power from the extreme right to the extreme left. However, in this case, it wasn't, these regimes did not come to power through the ballots, through votes. They came to power through military means, through the military. And the first thing they wanted to do after they captured power was what? Was to reproduce their own power. Because that's a prerequisite to realize your political and economic and social goals. So the first thing you want to do is to suppress alternative political ideologies. And this sets the rules, the trajectory, a path-dependent trajectory of repression in the region. Colonial powers were repressing societies for their own interests, and then now you have a regime with a new set of ideas repressing alternative political movements and society at large. That's what Nasser and others did in various countries. Leaders of the military coups occupied key positions within the state, and various social agencies. Usually, if it was a monarchy, they declared a republic because that was the progressive thing to do in the 50s and 60s, largely emulating the model of Ataturk's secular Turkey, and beginning to suppress the opposition. cleansing between quotations, the press, which in many cases they labeled as reactionary, and in some cases simply as collaborators with foreign agents. And of course, they dissolved all political parties and established more or less one-party rule. During these key moments, the tale that emerges in trying to reproduce the progressive program and platform, you begin to demarcate who's patriotic and who is a traitor. And this happens in all societies. And you dominate or monopolize the national narrative. However, and this story begins to come to an end in the 70s. Why? Because, I just wanted to read what basically the 1979 revolution in Iran, which comes a bit later than the ones that took place in the 50s and 60s in the Arab world. But this is a very important norm in the Islamic Republic now in Iran. This is the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, saying about Imam Khomeini, who was, of course, the leader of the Islamic Revolution. I quote him, he says, "Had the Islamic Revolution and our great Imam Khomeini not existed, there wouldn't be no hopes to end the hellish and mortifying domination or hegemony, which the US held over Iran." More or less, this is not unique to Iran. Nasser was saying the same about the British, the Algerians were saying the same thing about the French, and you name it. However, as these regimes were crystallizing, they were establishing their own regimes, trying to reproduce their own regime through repression, but also through socioeconomic means. They were clashing with other attempts to establish political freedoms, namely clashing with tales of freedom which emerged from various social forces within the state this time round, within each country. When oppositional movements were seeking freedom, they were being clashed. And here you begin to observe clashing of the two tales. One tale focusing on national interest and national unity. Of course, for most of these regimes, unity was important. The unity of the country against foreign intervention. Ironically, however, and this is what I call the tragedies of regime survival tactics, and you're talking here about the period between early 1970s and 2011, you begin to see this, that initially, as regimes were trying to suppress their oppositional movements, people within their country, they were establishing an authoritarian power, a hegemonic power. However, this caused a sense of insecurity. Why? Because external powers were also using domestic forces to topple the ruling regimes. So even the tales that were being used sometimes by regimes weren't necessarily lies. There was some truth about them. And we do see this in the region. For instance, if the US wanted to topple Saddam Hussein, they were basically supporting and collaborating with his internal rivals. This is where internal and external factors tend to intermingle in the case of the Middle East, which caused a sense of insecurity for the regime, made it more bloody and more repressive. But the more this happened, the more the state as a whole weakened, which also led to further external penetration, which then also heightened the sense of insecurity and intensified the authoritarian power. So this cycle which you're observing here is true in many of the countries of the region. Assad used to call, in his own narratives and tales, he used to talk about Syria's immunity against external penetration. And once again, we do see that after 2011, certain Syrian opposition leaders were collaborating with regional players and international players. And this offered Assad with the justification to further his repressive campaign. So you begin to see how these tales and attempts to establish freedom in the region continue to clash, leading to 2011. I'm coming closer to our times, and the phase I have in mind is Tales of an Arab Spring. And of course, it's between quotations. I think scholarly, the Arab Spring is not the best concept to use. I prefer to use uprisings or revolts. But it was called an Arab Spring, and this is part of the tales also. So there's some exaggeration about it. And this was in now we're in the 2000s, in 2010 and 2011, when suddenly we had an uprising in Tunisia by this, became later a hero, Mohammed Bouazizi, who was very angry when, you know the story, when a policewoman basically stopped his work because he didn't have a license for his vegetable cart, and he set himself on fire. And of course, it was an act of revolt. It was an act expressing anger, desperation, an act that also reflected the grievances of many Tunisians, and you could say many in the Arab world, who were unemployed or who didn't have opportunities to even, in his case, sell vegetables, but in many others to even improve their socioeconomic situations. This led to an uprising in Tunisia and ultimately to a revolution that toppled Ben Ali, the former president of Tunisia. And it triggered several revolts, starting in Tunisia, but then Egypt, Libya, and ultimately Bahrain, Syria, at a later stage Lebanon, and as we shall see, others too. It was a fateful event, going back to events. And this is where, during these contentious periods, it's where the past connects to the present, but then also connects to the future. It was a very important moment. It was a crossroad where the Arab world could have shifted to a democratic region, or democratic regions, or countries, but as we shall see, they also failed. But I want to focus here, having spoken a lot about the tales of regimes, but this is also a moment where the tales of the people began also to clash with regimes, but also to crush regimes, to deconstruct regime hegemonic ideals. And you do see these in the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, particularly the Midan al-Tahrir revolt in Egypt, or performance, which I happen to have studied it in some detail. But what we saw in Midan al-Tahrir, in this almost 2-week protest, against the military dictator or the dictator of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, which led to his toppling. It was more than a revolt, it was what I would call a performance. And the performance involves representation in a dramatic form. If you see these protests, this one from Lebanon with the hand, Thawra means revolution in Arabic. So they're mostly performances, but they also is a moment where the people are in conversation with two actors, with the ruling regime and the public. Just like any protest you might see on the streets of Barcelona, this is what you're usually trying to do. You're protesting against a specific target, but you also want to attract the public. You want them to join you. So a performance involves representation in dramatic form, and this is when a movement, a protest begins to attract people from the movement, but also people from outside it, and you want to communicate a message. In most of these revolts in the Arab world, there was a very powerful claim or demand. The people, I quote, the people want the fall of the regime. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. Very powerful. And of course, there's no room for debate during these moments because you've set a very high goal. You want the regimes to be toppled. And this was a moment where the narratives and the tales of the regimes were beginning to be exposed, where they were beginning to be deconstructed. And if you want to go a little bit further, these were moments where the people were beginning to construct the future. This is what happens in revolutions, and this is what we saw in the Arab world. But there are tales to the story. There are exaggerations even by the people. So we shouldn't be too romantic about it as scholars. Of course, at the moment, I was very excited about what was happening, and more or less during these moments, they're emotional. You tend to adopt what the people want. They want freedom. And they were asking this time round, unlike the 50s and 60s, they wanted individual freedom, dignity for the individuals. They don't want to be repressed anymore. They don't want to be detained anymore. They don't want to be humiliated by the police. They want to be able to be free as individuals, but also as political movements and parties. However, during these moments, just as regimes tend to talk about the state and the people, you begin to see the revolutionaries doing so. And during these moments, they have to show a united front, hence establishing an identity. We are the people. And these are moments where these movements and these performances, demonstrations, revolutions, whatever you want to term them, they tend to take the regime's narratives, especially ones that resonate with the public, and claim them. So now we speak on behalf of the people, not this corrupt and repressing regime. And this is what really they tried to do, choosing specific cultural and political values. In Egypt, for example, they spoke about the people being Eid Wahda, we're one people, unified under one banner. In Syria, the chanting was that the Syrian people, and specifically saying we're not Sunnis, a sectarian group within Islam, we're not Alawis, another sectarian group within Islam, we are just people wanting freedom. Now, why did they present themselves as a unified group? Simply because ruling regimes use the tactic of divide and rule. So the people were saying, you're not using this tactic anymore, we're conscious of it, We'll not let you play this game anymore. We're unified. Also ruling regimes, all regimes, authoritarian, fascist regimes in Europe and elsewhere in Latin America and in the East, tend to offer something for societies, and they do usually capitalize on this norm that we offer order. And most people want order. They don't want chaos. They want to get on with their lives. So what did the protesters suggest in Egypt? That their protest was one that they called silmiya in Arabic, which means peaceful. We, the people, they were saying, are not violent or terrorists as the regime is trying to portray us. We are honest people that we also care about Egypt or Syria or Bahrain, and we won't let the regime treat us as terrorists, quote unquote, or as violent people. And they were in conversation with, say, in the case of Egypt, with Mubarak. Let me quote him here speaking in January 2011. He said, the events of the last few days, and that's in the first 4 or 5 days of the revolt, require us all as a people, once again he's talking in the name of the people, and as a leadership to choose between chaos and stability. And regimes always give this two choices to the people. Do you want stability or do you want chaos that is fabricated by the revolutionaries? Of course, he was there to say, I continue to offer you with stability. And there were, of course, regimes in various parts of the world, of the Arab world, emphasizing that most of these protests were recipes for instability when the protesters were trying to present something different. And the last, now I just want to emphasize something, why I call them tales, because to be honest, the people are rarely unified because they're divided ideologically. And that was true in Egypt, in Syria, Bahrain, Lebanon, you name it. You have the left and the right, you have the secular and the Islamists, all wanting the regime to be toppled, but they don't necessarily have one vision for the future. And that's key to understand what came after the revolt. The last thing they did in these protests, an attempt also to speak to the tale, was what exactly happens in protests and in revolutions. What people do is to perform an alternative society. Because here you begin to imagine the future. You begin to present yourself as a leader of the future. And you begin to tell the public, remember the three actors, the regime, the revolutionaries, and the public, you begin to tell the public that this is how the future will look like if the revolution succeeds. So what you had in Midan al-Tahrir, for instance, you had an amazing 2 weeks where people were very, very democratic in the Midan itself, where you had the Islamists and the secular discussing their differences. You had Muslims praying and Christians protecting them so that the police guards and the regime agents don't infiltrate the demonstration and disintegrate it. You had people expressing their views. Even during these 2 weeks, you had women, especially female, felt protected. No sexual harassment, nothing during these specific 2 weeks. So they were also performing an alternative society. And this is the tale they were presenting as the tale of freedom. And regimes, of course, those who survived, like Assad or in Bahrain or in others who Other used economic means, if you are a rentier state such as Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, or Qatar, you used economic means to keep society happy, more or less regime tactics that are usually used. Or if you're in Libya, Iraq, Syria, or Tunisia, you probably used repression to survive in power, continuing to accuse the opposition of causing divisions and being collaborators. Sadly, many instances of revolts have failed to materialize into a transition to democracy. Syria entered into a civil war. In Egypt, we had a brief democratic respite, the first democratically elected president, but then we had a popular military coup that brought Abdel Fattah Sisi to power, and then the last attempt at democratic consolidation was in Tunisia, that also sadly did not succeed. I believe these two clashes of these two tales will continue to take place, but we are moving into, if you want, a new world order which will intensify and heighten the clash between the two tales of freedom. And that has to do with the emerging world. We're now in a world where you have also key competitors beyond the US and the Soviet Union, which is over. The US was the hegemonic power for a period, but now we have new powers. China, Brazil, Russia, and many, many others. Usually they're called BRICS, but you name them. And this is a world where more than one vision will be presented. The vision of democracy, usually presented by the West, but sometimes hypocritically presented by the West, because it's also a tale. It involves lies when the interests of the West clash with the norms that they carry. But you also have other tales presented by Putin in Russia or in China that more or less focus on the norms and tales that are presented in the Arab world by Arab dictatorships. Domestic stability, domestic national unity, and sovereignty as a key international norm, and usually accusing the West of double standards. But the West also offers reasons why it has double standards, and since now we are sadly in the moment of a war in Gaza and Palestine and southern Lebanon, we sometimes focus on Gaza. It is the big tragedy, but it's actually a war taking place in more than one spot in the region. And this is where I feel Western norms of freedom and democracy really faced a deadlock, especially compared to Western reaction to Ukraine. The feelings and perceptions in the Arab world are quite dire. They're very angry with the West, especially in its support. Most things are radically changing also, but mostly in its support of Israel, whose actions in Gaza itself are perceived by the ICJ as possibly constituting a genocide. Arab leaders and China and Putin will be observing these things and saying the West is hypocritical, and especially the suppression of students supporting the Palestinian cause and the ceasefire in Gaza in American campuses. They will be viewing this and saying, see, we're normal. That, I hate to say, will offer more reasons for these regimes to be repressive, which might also enable a new episode where we can see more revolts in the Arab world. So it could also be the calm before the storm. This is my story about the weight of history, how history has shaped the present in the region, but also how there are continuing attempts to shape the future, and this is ongoing as we speak. These are some of the links I used in the photos and maps I've chosen. And lastly, thank you for listening.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Professor Saouli, for this. Also, of course, particularly interesting that you brought out the importance of identity for us. We've had a class on the ideational dimension, so this connects very nicely. So I would like to hand over the floor to you now and to your questions. You can pose them, of course, in English, but also in Spanish if you want, or in Catalan. So please go ahead. There's a microphone, I suppose. Great. So who would like to break the ice and start with a question? If you need some time to think, I can also be the icebreaker. Because I think something that is quite striking that comes out here in your presentation is this idea of that the struggle for freedom, you know, what started initially as a struggle for freedom somehow also became a struggle for power, right? So initially this lofty goal of struggling for freedom, but then resulting in a struggle for power, and not only in a struggle for power, but then also to maintain that power. And interestingly, that yes, these struggles have not necessarily resulted, but not necessarily, but particularly somehow not resulted, right? Especially not resulted in democratic states, right? But rather in authoritarian ones.
Exactly, and I think we have to connect these changes and developments, especially in the 50s and 60s, to the process of state building. Because it does start with society producing various ideological movements and platforms, but then the next phase is these ideological movements competing with one another. And then, yes, it becomes a struggle for power. And sadly, in the case of the Middle East, you do see, after the initial revolutions, which brought what could be termed, at least in the language of the 50s and 60s, as progressive coalitions to power, what you begin to see are competitions within power, within these regimes, initially between various strands. It could be Arab nationalists versus the communists, or when the Arab nationalists, say in Syria or Iraq, managed to capture power, then you had within them different rivalries between the right and the left. And then sadly, these continue to take place, making it a struggle over power where you end up with ruling families, whether it's the Saddam Hussein family in Iraq or the Assad family in Syria, who's ruling parts of Syria now. It's Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafiz al-Assad, who came to power in 1970. So the power was contracting, becoming smaller and smaller from a wide coalition to the rule of a family. When the US invasion led to the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, you were primarily talking about 50 individuals ruling Iraq, very small circle of power. So yes, sadly, but it was these processes that gave rise to the opposition, which then materialized in the last phase.
And then also hooking onto this, also to what you said, that these processes, I mean, or these events in the past set into motion a process that perpetuates into the future. And I'm wondering here, does not this then also set an important precedent for now? So how
You mean the last 20?
So how to get out of this, the struggle for freedom that results in the struggle for power into authoritarianism? So what's
exactly?
It's not that the precedent, so how to get out?
Yeah,
or what's next?
I think there are two things we probably need to focus on. The first, we do need to understand that at these crossroads, when a society revolts against the ruling regime, that's not democratization yet.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the first mere phase where a ruling regime is toppled.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, in historical terms, that's the easy part. It's what happens next that is very, very crucial. I think what happened during the Arab uprisings, now many people like to call it the Arab winter. It's not the spring, it's the winter. Arab regimes like to call it, these were episodes where a few movements internally were supported by external factors. So it wasn't about people wanting freedom.
Mm-hmm.
They present it as conspiracies, and then they show their people, see what happens when you revolt.
Mm-hmm.
You get a civil war in Syria. You get refugees, you get chaos, you get blood. That in itself scares people. That in itself scares people. And regimes have won in this last episode. Sadly, but they have. And they now reproduce their tales by showing what's happening. But I think there's an important factor, and that's for the future, is what societies have learned from these episodes. Because when revolts happens, there are really two dimensions to it. One, you have leaders of movements who are conscious of the past. They know that this is what happened in 2012, we were repressed, and that's what we should avoid. And then there is also improvisation. There is also new people who emerge. There is the youth who is willing to take risks and adventure. And I think it's this caution and adventure, a balance between the two, that would set a new wave of protests for change. So, yes, there's a failure, but the story continues. Regimes trying to reproduce their rule by scaring the people, and then you have the people are conscious of these attempts too. So actually, after the Arab uprisings, we had 3 key uprisings. One in Lebanon in 2019, which was quite revolutionary on many levels. One in Iraq in the same year, and one in 2018 in Sudan, which also set new trajectories. I also want, and I think we must emphasize that the norm of democracy still has to, if you want, be implanted in the political consciousness and in the political movements of the region. That's key. Because unlike the 50s and 60s, most or the dominant political models were socialism, communism, Arab nationalism, and nationalism. All of these models did not really emphasize the norm of democracy. Are things changing at a normative level? Possibly, but in my view, that's key. People have to reach a point where they accept that democracy, we might disagree on what it means, but it is a good framework to negotiate our differences. In the history of this country, in Spain, I think it did take a coalition of forces to accept democracy as a political framework which contributed to the transition, moving beyond the extreme right and extreme left. In the Arab world, we're not there just yet.
So maybe we can say we have not seen the last episode yet, and it's not yet an Arab winter. So maybe we're, moving from the spring into the summer, into the autumn, and then maybe the winter will come, so that maybe we can say that this implanting of the norm of democracy is a process that began with the Arab uprisings in 2011, and we have not seen the end of it yet. It's still an ongoing struggle, and this implanting of the norm of democracy, etc. So maybe we're hopeful. We remain hopeful.
People have to be hopeful because they have nothing but hope. And hope is part of the tale and part of their identity, and it constructs the future. They have to be hopeful. I have to be hopeful too. It's May, and I'm looking forward to the summer. So.
Yes. What about our audience? Would you like to pitch in? You can also, you don't need to connect to our last words now especially. You can also come in with a question, about the lecture or connected to it. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. You said that in order to reproduce power, the regimes tried to promote their own tales. So I was wondering what happened with those tales based in history. Because I guess that as long as you teach them, for example, with the religious tale, as long as you teach them about the caliphate, I don't know if it's like that, there is someone that is going to try to use that tale to promote other values than the ones that the regime has. Well, thank you. That's the question.
Okay.
Thank you so much. No, it's because so that our audience on YouTube can hear it as well. Thank you.
I was wondering, how likely do you think another uprising is now, or in the upcoming months, especially seeing what's happening in Palestine and how civil society across Arab countries, they are protesting in solidarity, and I guess they also make the links with the governments being complicit with the genocide. So yeah, I was wondering, what do you think about that?
Thank you. Shall I address the questions or take more?
Is there an immediate one right now? So maybe we go with these two, and then we see if anything else comes up in the meantime.
Yes, thank you for your question. I mean, you still have, societies have different views and different ideologies, and the Islamist one, for instance, it's still available. A key question is, what kind of tales and stories will they make of the latest round of revolts? Some Islamists might conclude that these regimes can only be toppled through violence. Some Islamists and some leftists would do that. Mm-hmm. Other Islamists might learn a different lesson, to say maybe we do need to prioritize democracy as a framework because that gives us a chunk, a small chunk of power in society and potentially in government. So it largely depends on how you will interpret history and come up with your new tales for the future. But you're right, some will continue to look at the past. So in that sense, as we are constructing the future, we always have an eye looking back, because it gives us, if you want, the only experience we have. And that's true of other political movements, depending on the ideological framework you find yourself in. But the big question, the challenging one, is, will most of these movements accept the norm of democracy and the democratic state as a potential framework to fight for? If they do, then you do have a large coalition of forces potentially preparing the ground for a new revolt, which takes me to your question. Is it possible to have another uprising? I mean, it's very hard to predict. I don't usually do predictions, but if we are to look at the past, then there are some conditions that might lead us to think that in some countries that is possible, because there is more than one factor that might be brewing at the moment. Socioeconomic difficulties in a country such as Egypt, or maybe Tunisia, or maybe Algeria, or maybe Syria, but also the factor of Palestine. We need to remember something that is very important, again, looking at the past. What triggered the social movement in Egypt in 2000 was the Second Intifada. Many Egyptians felt that the government that is supposed to represent them did not stand by the Palestinians, and hence it didn't reflect their emotions, their identities, their political stand. In this episode, it's even more difficult because many Arab peoples didn't feel they have even the freedom to express not what they like, not only what they like to see their governments doing, but only to scream. You know, when you scream before you actually ask for something, when you're like, it's like crying before you know what you actually want. So sadly, in many Arab parts of the Arab world, they didn't even get this opportunity. They would have expected at least that their governments reflect their emotional. I mean, with the exception of the tales and narratives of the Jordanian government, to an extent, it was speaking in tune with what the people are expecting. Maybe, of course, Erdogan's Turkey could be another example, regardless of the material action, diplomatic or economic or military. We're just speaking in terms of narrative. So you're right, there is a lot of anger. Will it translate at one point into a protest? Very likely, if you ask me. But they are also facing strong regimes in the narratives they're using. Now, especially in countries where the first phase, what we call the Arab Spring, continues to be alive in the memories of people. And people, like any human beings, they don't want chaos. They don't want blood. They do want change, but they don't want to see themselves living in a country like Syria now. Disintegrated, poor, half of the population had to migrate, seek refuge elsewhere, poverty, you name it, all possible problems. Sudan, where we all sadly also might be facing some sort of genocide or war crimes, to say the least. And so regimes do tell the people, once again, like Mubarak told his people, do you want these models? Then yes, protest. If you want stability, stick to me. So they are facing these problems. And it's not going to be easy, but we also learn from the past that it starts with a spark. It was a spark in Tunisia. No one planned for a revolution. It's hard unless you are a communist and you're constantly planning for a revolution. Fair enough. But generally speaking, most of the people join a protest usually emotionally. You know, emotions are alive, and then even if you're not political, even if you're not an activist, you'd say, I'm not going to my job today. If I'm a teacher or I work in a bank or this, I'm going to join the protest because I'm sick and tired. So will this happen? In some cases, very likely. In others, unlikely, where the economic factors are good enough to prevent people from revolting, as in many cases of the Gulf, where even the norm of democracy is not necessarily a priority at this stage.
Is there anything else you would like to add on? Good. Okay, wonderful. Then I'd say we conclude the session with an applause for our speaker, Professor Adham Saouli.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you.